The old harbour of St. Helena doesn't speak anymore, but it listens. It listens to the tide scrape against black stone, to the chains that no longer hold prisoners but still rattle in the wind, to the silence of men who saw too much and told no one. If you were to stand there tonight, under the gaslight flicker and the hiss of salt air, you might hear it. The sound of water hitting wood in a rhythm too precise to be random, a cadence older than the island itself. That rhythm was the first sign, the one the islanders learned to fear, the one tied to the ritual no outsider was meant to know. They buried it under layers of local myth and faded church records, rewrote it as folklore for the tourists, and laughed when asked about it. Because the truth is not something you give away for free. But in the winter of 1824, something happened that forced it into the open. It began with a ship, an unmarked brig that docked at night with its sails torn and its crew silent, every man with his head shaved, each wearing the same corded rope around his neck. They walked off the gangplank in single file, eyes fixed forward, ignoring the lanterns, the customs officer, the murmuring crowd, and headed directly toward the inland cliffs, where no one lived. By morning, all were gone. Only a single carving remained in the stone at the cliff's base, a circle intersected by 3 jagged lines. The church called it pagan. The governor called it nothing. But the elders knew. It was the mark of returning, a sign that the ritual had been invoked again, a ritual older than St. Helena's colonial records, older than its maps, older than the very name it carried. And yet, it was never about the island. It was about control, about the invisible agreements that decide who thrives and who disappears. You think you know history because you've read the official accounts. But what if I told you they are on? Leave the shadows cast by the real events. You're about to hear a truth that will not leave you unchanged, because the moment you understand the ritual, you will start to see its fingerprints everywhere, not just in St. Helena, but in every place where power hides behind faith, and faith hides behind fear. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The question is, are you ready to bear the weight of knowing? The elders called it the agreement, though no paper was ever signed, and no oath was ever spoken aloud. It was a covenant passed silently from one generation of power to the next, an understanding so deep that breaking it was not punished by law, but by something older, something colder. When the unmarked brig came in that night of 1824, the agreement was simply being renewed, not started, not ended. Renewed. You see, St. Helena was never meant to be a mere outpost for empire. It was a node, a hidden point on a map of influence that stretched like a spider's web across oceans and centuries. And the ritual? It was the maintenance of that web, the recalibration of the invisible balance between those who command and those who obey without knowing they obey. No outsider had ever witnessed it in its entirety, but fragments leaked. In the form of children's rhymes no one remembered teaching, in church hymns with verses that were never in the Bible, in carvings on the underside of pews hidden from the priest's gaze. The circle with 3 jagged lines, the mark of returning, was not just a symbol. It was an instruction, a map in miniature, a directive to gather in a place not on any official survey of the island. The cliff was only an entry point, the mouth of something hollow. Imagine walking through stone corridors, not carved by tools, but by something that moved like thought, shifting and adjusting itself to those who entered. The elders said the air down there tasted different, metallic, heavy, as though the rock itself was breathing with you. Those who returned from the ritual, if they returned, were never quite the same. They spoke slower, watched longer, and seemed to recognize strangers, as if they'd met them long ago in some place neither would name. And here's the part that history books will never write. The agreement was not just for St. Helena, it was an export. A model, refined and replicated in port cities, in colonial capitals, in quiet little towns far from any sea. The ritual created the template for what we now call institutional order. Your schools, your courts, your parliaments, all carry its architecture. And yet, no one speaks of it, because to speak of it is to undo it, and to undo it is to draw its gaze. Do you understand what that means? It means that even now, as you hear these words, you've already stepped closer to the edge of the cliff yourself, and the wind is beginning to change. The path into the cliff was not lit by torch or lantern. The elders said light itself bent differently inside, as though it resisted the human eye. You could see just enough to move forward, never enough to see far ahead. The floor was damp, but not from sea water. The air carried a faint vibration, like the low hum of a distant drum. No one spoke once they entered. Speech was not forbidden. It was simply useless, as though the rock absorbed every word before it could reach another ear. At the first bend, the markings began, shallow grooves in the stone forming spirals and intersecting lines, patterns that seemed random until you stared too long, and then they began to align into faces, eyes, hands, raised in silent command. They called this the threshold. A point of no return. Once you crossed it, the island itself no longer cared who you were before. Further in, the space widened into a chamber that felt both ancient and alive. The walls breathed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The floor pulsed faintly beneath your feet. In the center stood a black stone altar, not carved but grown, its surface reflecting shapes that were not in the room. The participants gathered in a perfect circle, each placing their right hand on the rope around their neck, a gesture older than the colony, older than the faith they pretended to follow above ground. Then came the sound. Not music, not chant, but a vibration deep enough to rattle the bones in your jaw. It was said that this was the moment the agreement was renewed, when those chosen would offer something of themselves. Not always blood, not always life, but always something they would never get back. The ritual did not end when they left the chamber. It seeped into them, rewired how they saw the world, what they could no longer ignore. When they emerged back into the salt air of the island, they looked like the same men who had arrived, but every glance, every pause, carried a weight that others could feel but never name. And this is where the deeper truth lies. The curse of St. Helena was not in the ritual itself, but in what it planted inside those who survived it, a seed that could grow anywhere, in any century, in any nation that thought itself immune to the old ways, a seed that still grows today, unnoticed by those who walk past it every day. You have to understand something. The curse was never a simple matter of superstition or island folklore. It was engineered, precise. The work of minds who understood not only human fear but human obedience. The seed planted in that chamber did not bloom immediately. It waited, patient as stone, until the right conditions drew it to the surface. For some it came in the form of influence, an uncanny ability to bend others toward their will without raising their voice. For others it was a gnawing pull toward places and people they had no logical reason to seek. Those touched by the ritual became quiet architects, placing symbols in buildings, structuring rules in ways that felt harmless, but guided entire communities toward obedience without ever using the word. And yet, there was a cost. Their dreams were never their own again. They saw the same images night after night, a spiral drawn in sand, a circle broken by jagged lines, water rushing upward as though gravity had reversed. Many tried to bury these visions under drink, work, or prayer, but the more they resisted, the more the ritual's logic guided their waking life. The agreement was self-sustaining, no longer requiring the presence of the island to operate, because those who carried it became the island. In the years following 1824, men who had walked into that cliff were found decades later in London, Boston, Cape Town, building institutions whose designs mirrored the chamber's layout. The curse was not death. It was replication. Imagine walking into a courthouse built 3,000 miles from St. Helena, yet finding the same spiral carved beneath the judge's bench, or stepping into a bank vault in the city and feeling that same low vibration in your jaw. It is no accident. It is no coincidence. It is the ritual finding new soil. And the truth is, you have already seen it yourself. Maybe in a logo, in the flu, out a pattern of a train station, in the way certain buildings pull your gaze upward without reason. Once your mind registers it, the pattern will not release you. That is why those who know rarely speak. Not because they fear disbelief, but because they fear awakening another set of eyes to the web, a web that once seen can never be unseen, and once felt can never be escaped. The first time the ritual left St. Helena, it did not leave in chains or on parchment. It left inside a man named Elias Crow, a shipwright whose hands had built more vessels than he could count. Yet after that night in the cliff, he never again set foot in a dockyard. Crow left the island under the guise of illness, boarding a merchant brig bound for Cape Town. Those who watched him leave swore he did not blink once as the sails caught the wind. In Cape Town he took no trade, no wife, no public role. Yet within 2 years the city's central hall was rebuilt, its floor tiles arranged in a spiral pattern never explained in the architect's notes. The acoustics altered so that a man speaking from the center could be heard with unnatural clarity in every corner without raising his voice. That was the first replication. The second came in Boston, where Crow arrived in 1832, older but untouched by time in ways that made men uneasy. He met with bankers, lawyers, clergy, always in private, always in rooms without windows. Months later, the city opened a new courthouse, its main chamber built in a circular design almost identical to the chamber in St. Helena. The judge's bench aligned perfectly with the rising sun on the equinox, an alignment that served no legal purpose, but every symbolic one. From there, the seed spread like a map unfolding, each location tied to the next, not by trade or war, but by design. Patterns repeated. 3 jagged lines carved discreetly into woodwork, doorways that narrowed just enough to slow a man's step, ceilings that forced the head to tilt upward, subtly shaping the body's posture. Every feature was a psychological device, a way of reminding the unconscious mind that it was entering a space where unseen authority resided. Crow never stayed long enough to be questioned, and those who tried to follow his trail often met with sudden accidents or the slow unraveling of their fortunes. By the time his name was whispered in London, the design had already infiltrated Parliament chambers, Masonic halls, and bank vaults. It is here you must understand. The ritual's true strength was never in its secrecy, but in its invisibility. To the untrained eye, these were simply buildings, simply designs. Yet to those who had walked into the cliff and returned, they were the continuation of an ancient oath, and each new structure was another mouth through which the ritual could speak to the world without a sound. The architecture of the ritual was never meant to impress. It was meant to condition, to guide the mind into compliance without ever letting it realize it was being shaped. Step into one of these chambers and you would feel it before you understood it. The narrowing of corridors forcing you to slow, the widening spaces making you feel small, the deliberate shift in acoustics, making your own voice sound distant, as though it belonged to someone else. This was not random design. It was the physical language of power, and those who knew how to speak it could bend entire populations without issuing a single command. The floors often carried subtle spirals, not enough to be noticed, but enough to make the eyes drift inward toward the center. The human body would unconsciously adjust its stance, weight leaning forward, attention drawn exactly where the builder intended. Light was controlled with surgical precision, never too bright, never evenly spread. Pockets of shadow forcing the eyes to adapt, the brain to stay on alert. Even the smell of these places was deliberate. Cedar oil, stone dust, faint traces of iron. Each scent chosen to evoke memory, to anchor the mind to the moment without conscious thought. Those who had walked the St. Helena ritual knew that once a man's senses could be tuned without his awareness, his beliefs could be shifted just as easily. This is why the agreement thrived, because it operated not in the realm of law or threat, but in the silent corridors of the human nervous system. Think of how you have felt in certain buildings, the quiet awe in a cathedral, the tension in a courtroom, the unease in a narrow alley. Now imagine those feelings engineered, replicated, and aligned with symbols that have existed longer than your country, longer than your faith. Once a man is conditioned in such spaces, the conditioning travels with him, invisible. T-active, shaping how he stands, how he speaks, even how he chooses his words. The builders did not need to be present because the walls themselves were the instructors, and this is why the curse of St. Helena was never truly broken, because you cannot destroy a structure once it is replicated in the mind. You can burn a hall to the ground, but if those who entered it carry its design inside them, they will simply build it again, brick by brick, gesture by gesture, thought by thought, and they will never tell you why they built it that way. The first real attempt to break the ritual came from a man named Jonathan Hale, a magistrate in Boston who had studied in London and returned home with more than just legal knowledge. Hale had seen the chamber designs in Parliament, had walked their polished floors, had felt the pull of their geometry, and when Boston unveiled its new courthouse in 1834, he recognized the layout instantly. He understood something most never did, that the spiral floor was not just a pattern, it was a trap for the eye, that the central point of the chamber was positioned exactly where voices would resonate longest, that the high windows created light that fell like bars upon those standing in the center. Hale began quietly marking these features in sketches, drawing lines and angles late into the night, convinced that if he could map the design, he could undo it. His plan was simple in theory: dismantle the structure's psychological pull by breaking its symmetry, misalign the geometry, disrupt the flow. But he underestimated what he was dealing with. The night before his changes were to be approved, he woke to find the spiral carved into his bedroom floorboards. Not painted, carved, the grooves deep and fresh, yet no sound had woken him. The air in the room was cold and heavy, and though he searched the entire house, no intruder was found. Over the following weeks, Hale began to falter in his work, his hand shaking as he tried to draw straight lines, his thoughts drifting back to the chamber in St. Helena, though he had never set foot on the island. Witnesses claimed he began speaking in a slower, measured tone, his gaze fixed on points in the room that no one else could see. By winter, the courthouse stood exactly as designed, every line, every curve untouched. Hale vanished soon after, last seen boarding a ship bound for an unlisted destination, the ticket purchased under a name that did not belong to him. Some say he went to St. Helena itself, drawn like a thread pulled back to the loom. Others believe the ritual simply claimed him, absorbing his resistance as it had absorbed so many others. The lesson was clear. The curse could not be dismantled by force or by logic alone, because it was not built of stone and mortar, it was built of minds, and once a mind was touched by it, it became part of the structure forever. There is a rule in the ritual that no written record ever states, yet every man who has carried it understands it without being told. It is this: to fight the structure, you must first understand it, but to understand it is to invite it inside you. This is the lock and the key being the same thing, the trap that swallows both enemies and allies alike. Those who entered the cliff on St. Helena did not always return in chains. Some returned believing they were free, believing they could resist. But the moment they saw the pattern in another place, felt the pull in another building, heard the hum in another chamber, it was over. The ritual is not passed by blood. It is passed by recognition, by the mind's acceptance of its language. Think of a song you cannot forget. Even when you try, the melody returns without effort. The lyrics surface without consent. The ritual works the same way. But instead of music, it is space, light, vibration, and the positioning of human bodies in relation to one another. Once the geometry of power is understood, it becomes impossible not to see, and once seen, it begins to shape how you build, how you speak, how you command. This is why every rebellion against it eventually folds back into it. Leaders rise to destroy it, but in building their own movements, they recreate the same designs, the same conditioning, because it is the most efficient way to control others. The curse is not that you are enslaved to it. The curse is that you will use it. There is a reason the elders called it the agreement, because once you see the architecture of obedience, you face a choice. Let others control you with it, or use it yourself. Both paths lead to the same end. This is why resistance is rare and why history records so few attempts. Not because no one sees it, but because those who do either vanish or become the very thing they tried to destroy. And if you think you would choose differently, remember, the moment you hear its hum in your bones, the moment the walls seem to breathe with you, you are already speaking its language, and it is already speaking through you. The first time the ritual was weaponized to break an entire city without a single shot fired was in 1847 in the port of Varro's End, a city so fiercely independent that no empire, church, or merchant syndicate had ever managed to fully control it. Its people were stubborn, its leaders unyielding, its economy untouchable, at least until a man arrived on a ship with no flag, a man who never gave his name, but claimed to be an architect sent to improve the city's civic halls. The council accepted his offer because they thought they were hiring a builder. They had no idea they were letting the ritual into their bones. Within a year, 3 new buildings stood in the heart of Varro's End: a courthouse, a trade exchange, and a central registry, each designed in the same quiet geometry that had left St. Helena 2 decades earlier. The spiral floors, the narrowing corridors, the perfectly aligned acoustics, all of it replicated without a word of its purpose. The citizens entered these spaces for ordinary matters: a hearing, a contract, a record request. But something happened in those walls. People began speaking less in public, standing a little farther from each other in the streets, their voices dropping when certain names were mentioned. Merchants who had fought bitterly over trade rights suddenly came to agreements in hushed tones, decisions made without debate. It wasn't submission, not in the way chains bind a prisoner. It was more subtle, more permanent, a quiet reordering of thought that made resistance seem unnecessary, even irrational. Within 2 years, Varro's End had signed over its independence to the very empire it had defied for centuries. No troops were stationed, no battles were fought. The city simply folded. And when questioned about the change, the citizens insisted it was their own idea. The nameless architect was gone by then, his blueprints missing. His records erased, yet his work remained. The building still standing, still humming, still pulling unseen strings. What happened in Varro's End became a model, a proof of concept for those who carried the ritual, a way to conquer without the stain of war. It was here the agreement took its boldest form, a belief that true power was not in taking land or resources, but in rearranging the minds of those who lived upon it until they believed the change was their own doing. And from that moment on, the ritual no longer needed secrecy. It needed only patience. In America, the ritual did not arrive with a storm or a declaration. It arrived draped in patriotism, hidden in the blueprints of city halls, courthouses, banks, and universities. It wore the face of tradition, the voice of civic pride, the polished language of democracy. Yet beneath the marble and the flags, the same geometry waited, the same spirals and alignments that had been carried from St. Helena like a seed in the mind. When the first state capitals were built, the architects spoke of efficiency, of beauty, of grandeur. But the placement of chambers, the rise of staircases, the precise distance between columns were not accidents. They were instructions. Step inside the rotunda of a capitol building and stand at its center. Speak a single word and feel how it carries, how it returns to you. That is the hum of the ritual. The rows of seats in legislative halls curve inward not only for visibility, but to draw all eyes to a single point. The subtle narrowing of doors into courtrooms forces the body to slow and the breath to change. The carvings in wood and stone conceal symbols that most will never notice, but all will respond to unconsciously. Even the town squares in small cities follow the pattern, their fountains or monuments placed in positions of control within the invisible map. This is why people often describe feeling a strange mixture of awe and obedience in these places without knowing why. They think it is patriotism, respect for law, reverence for history. But it is the same conditioning that pulled men into the cliff on St. Helena, rewritten in the language of the New World. Once you begin to see it, you will find it in courthouses, libraries, train stations, museums, even in the layout of public parks. It is a silent inheritance passed through the hands of builders who may not even know the origin of the designs they replicate, yet the effect is the asaiki, me. And here is the most dangerous part. The ritual thrives best when its presence is mistaken for something noble, because no one resists what they believe is their own choice. In America, it does not need secrecy because it wears the clothes of freedom, and those who walk under its arches will swear they are free. But the walls know otherwise, and the walls remember. I brought the book into the candlelight, thinking it was just another parish registry. Births, deaths, marriages, the quiet bookkeeping of a forgotten island. But the first thing I noticed was that the ink was not black. It had a deep brown sheen, as though it had once been red, as though it had been drawn from somewhere living. The parchment was thick, brittle, but there was an oily smoothness that made my skin crawl when I turned the first page. Each entry was a name followed by a series of marks that didn't belong to any language I knew, almost like tally marks, but slanted and uneven, as though they had been carved with trembling hands. Halfway down the page, I saw a date. March 12th, 1793. The day an entire fishing village on the North Shore vanished without warning. Yet here, in this book, beside the date, were not just the names of the missing, but the names of people who were still alive, people I had passed in the streets that morning. I flipped ahead and found my own name, the ink still fresh compared to the rest, and beside it, 3 slanted marks. It was then I understood this was not a record of what had happened. It was a record of what would happen. The tally marks were not random. They were a countdown, a measure of how many nights remained before the person named would be taken. But taken by what? I did not know. Behind me the door creaked open, though I had locked it myself, and the old priest stepped in, his eyes fixed on the ledger. "Not me," he whispered, not in greeting, but as though reciting a prayer meant for no human ear. "You should not have opened that." And in the dim flicker of the candle I saw his hands. The fingertips darkened, cracked, as if the blood in them had dried centuries ago. By the summer of 1863, the island had become a place where whispers travelled faster than the wind, a place where the ocean's roar seemed to carry secrets from the Black Reef to the convent walls. The bishop had sent word from Cape Town that an official inspection was to be made. But no one on St. Helena believed it was for the reasons written in the letter. The paper spoke of financial audits and curriculum reviews. Yet those who had seen the old ledgers knew better. They had seen the blank spaces where the names of certain girls had been neatly erased, as if they had never set foot on the island. On the night before the inspection, Sister Agnes was seen carrying a small black-bound book across the courtyard, its cover glistening faintly in the moonlight, as though the leather itself was wet. She vanished into the east wing, the one sealed to outsiders, and when she returned her hands were clean, but her eyes would not meet anyone's gaze. The next morning, the bishop's ship arrived, but the air felt wrong. The gulls had gone silent, the dogs would not bark, and the town's fishermen refused to come ashore. Witnesses later claimed the bishop was in the convent for less than an hour before leaving abruptly, his face pale, his steps hurried, his luggage abandoned. He boarded his vessel without speaking to the governor, and his ship sailed away before the tide had even turned. The convent's bells rang at dusk, but no mass was held. Instead, a low chanting was heard from behind the chapel's locked doors, a sound so deep it seemed to hum through the stones. That same week, 3 girls were sent home early to their families, each pale and trembling, each refusing to speak of what they had seen. Their parents, once loyal to the sisters, now kept their doors barred after dark. And in the months that followed, a new habit emerged in Jamestown. At sunset, every household would burn a small bundle of rosemary at their windows, a ritual no one explained, but everyone obeyed. For on an island as small as St. Helena, you don't need to know the whole truth to fear it. You only need to see the eyes of those who have... The wind outside the Black Cathedral roared against the high stone walls, as if trying to tear the structure down. Yet inside the air felt unnaturally still, pressing in on my skin like the inside of a sealed tomb, Reverend Matthew Kane led me deeper into the restricted wing, his lantern casting long, trembling shadows along the warped corridor. We stopped before a door made of blackened oak and bound in iron straps, the wood so scarred and pitted it looked as if something had clawed it for decades. He pressed a tarnished key into the lock, and when it turned, I heard not the click of metal, but the unmistakable sound of a deep, wet inhale from somewhere beyond. The smell that drifted out was worse than rot. It was the scent of blood left to soak in stone for centuries. The room inside was windowless, its walls lined with shelves holding jars of darkened fluid, each containing fragments of bone and strips of skin etched with Latin script. Kane whispered that these were not relics, but bindings. Pieces of those who had been taken in St. Helena over the last 200 years, their remains preserved as seals, to keep something far older from crossing into the waking world. On the far wall, a circle was drawn in a thick black substance that glistened in the lantern light, its lines jagged and trembling as if made by a shaking hand. In its center was a small wooden chair, and upon it sat what I first thought was a child's skeleton until its jaw shifted, and it began to speak in a voice that was not human. It told me the disappearances in St. Helena were not random, that every victim was chosen, and that the next would not be taken. They would be delivered. Kane's hand tightened on my shoulder, his nails digging into my skin, and he said that once I saw the list, I would understand why I could never leave this town alive. By morning, the town of Jamestown was already stirring with unease, but not in the loud, chaotic way that panic normally spreads. Instead, it was the slow creep of glances over shoulders, conversations ending the moment another person passed by. Doors that had been open for decades now shut with bolts sliding into place. The air carried something heavier than fog. It carried the weight of names unspoken, names that had been uttered once and never again. Thomas Wakefield stood on the narrow dirt path that wound between the harbour and the old churchyard, his boots sinking into the damp earth as if the island itself wanted to hold him in place. His hands trembled not from cold, but from the memory of the night before, the sound of shuffling footsteps beyond the fog, footsteps that never drew closer yet, never faded away, as though circling him, watching. He had gone to find Father Lucien before dawn, but found the rectory empty, the small brass key still in the lock, the window above the desk open as if someone had stepped out into the darkness and never returned. On the desk was a single piece of parchment, the edges singed as though it had been pulled from fire, with only 3 words written in a hurried scrawl. St. Helena watches. By mid-morning, Abigail Moore from Market Street came to Thomas's door, her eyes bloodshot, clutching a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. When she unwrapped it, the smell of salt and rot poured into the room. Inside was a child's shoe, small enough for a girl of no more than 8, the leather warped as if it had been submerged in seawater for years. Yet Abigail swore she had found it hanging on her front gate that morning, its laces tied into a knot she could not undo. Thomas took the shoe and set it on the table between them, the two of them staring at it as though it might begin to move, and then from somewhere deep in the harbour came the faint toll of a bell, not the sharp clang of the dock bells, but a slow and deliberate chime, the kind that marks a burial, the sound rolling through the fog and settling in their chests like a warning they were already too late. The silence in St. Helena was never truly silent. It was a breathing thing, thick with whispers that slithered along the corridors, curling into the ears of anyone who dared stay awake past the ringing of the 10th bell. And in that hour, when the lamps dimmed to a trembling amber, Robert Ellsworth stood in the kitchen, staring at the old bread oven that Sister Miriam had sealed shut with 3 rusted nails, his hands shaking not from the cold, but from the memory of the scratching sounds he had once heard from within its brick belly. Sounds too deliberate to be rats, too faint to be claws of any animal he knew. The sound of something that understood patience, something that had waited decades for human hands to return to it. And when he finally pried the nails free, the oven door fell open with a slow groan like a throat clearing before speech, and what came out was not heat nor smoke, but a breath colder than the ocean wind, carrying with it the scent of lavender and iron, the scent that every missing girl's room had reeked of on the night she vanished, and Robert, though he wanted to step back, though his muscles screamed to run, could not stop himself from leaning in, staring into the dark cavity where shadows moved not with the flicker of light, but with their own slow heartbeat. And behind him, from the doorway, Sister Miriam's voice slid into the air like a blade into cloth, soft, unhurried, and impossible to ignore, saying only, "You should not have done that, Robert. You have no idea what you've let breathe again." When I pried up the warped planks in the attic's farthest corner, a place the locals in Jamestown swore was cursed since before the war, my fingers closed around brittle parchment, folded into itself so many times that it felt like fragile bone beneath my touch. The ink had faded to the shade of dried blood, yet the name on the first line was unmistakable. Eleanor Marsh, of St. Helena. The date written in looping, trembling hand read August 3rd, 1872, and the letter began without pleasantries, only a desperate command. Do not let the girls leave the island alive. Each word pulled my pulse tighter, the script twisting into confessions that felt like whispers from a dying throat. It spoke of locked rooms beneath the convent, of the midnight practice that had taken 5 already, of men arriving by boat under moonless skies to remove the bodies before dawn. It spoke of a ledger kept in the possession of Reverend Colby in New Orleans, and of a promise to the governor himself that certain births would never be recorded in any registry. The signature at the bottom made my skin tighten. Margaret Hale, a name I had heard before from a fisherman in Half Tree Hollow who refused to say more than, she was the last to look them in the eyes. But here was her voice, frozen in ink, begging someone, anyone, to stop whatever St. Helena had been doing under its marble floors for decades. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, hammering the shutters until the room seemed to throb with it. And for the first time since setting foot in this place, I felt the weight of the island pressing inward, not just from the sea but from the walls themselves, as if the black cathedral of St. Helena did not want me to leave with this letter, as if every brick in Jamestown was leaning forward to listen to what I would do next, knowing there was no way to turn back without becoming part of the story myself. The rain had returned by morning, not in the gentle rhythm of the night before, but in a relentless sheet that blurred the horizon and made the entire island feel smaller, more suffocating. The sound of it on the roof above my head was a constant hiss, like a whisper I couldn't quite catch, as if the sky itself wanted me to turn back. But turning back was no longer an option. By then the names in the ledger were etched into my mind, and one in particular would not let me rest. Marion Cole of Liverpool, a woman who had come to St. Helena in 1849 and left no record of departure. I traced her entry with my fingertip. The ink faded but still stubbornly there, as if someone had wanted to erase it but stopped halfway. I asked Father Renaud if he knew the name, and his eyes flickered just once, before he told me he could not speak of it. The way he said it made me feel as though saying her name aloud carried a weight I couldn't yet understand. I decided to search for her in the island's cemetery, but there was no grave, no cross, no stone. Instead, the caretaker, an old man named Elias Green, told me she was still here in a way, and that I should look in the West Chapel if I dared. The West Chapel was not used for Mass anymore. Its wooden doors warped from humidity, and its pews thick with dust. I stepped inside, and the air smelled faintly of brine, as if the sea itself had crept into the building. And there, behind the altar, was a small recess in the wall, a sealed door, edges lined with the same pale powder I'd seen in the crypts, the same that clung to the ledger pages where Marion's name was written. I reached toward it and felt an almost imperceptible vibration, like the faint hum of a heartbeat coming from behind the stone. I was not ready to open it, not yet, but I knew it would not leave me alone until I did. The powder along the chapel seam looked like simple dust, but it clung to my skin with a bitter taste, like old bone. I traced the line with a candle stub, and the flame guttered sideways, as if the stone exhaled. Beside the recess, someone had scratched 3 jagged marks into the mortar, the mark of returning, the same sign from the cliff path and the hidden ledgers. My hand moved before my caution could catch it, Wax dripped into the cracks. The seal softened, and the slab loosened with a sound like wet cloth torn in a quiet room. Behind it, a pocket of air rolled out. Cold, mineral, faintly sweet. The odor of roses left too long in water. A shelf waited inside the cavity, not wood, not stone. Something black and smooth, as if the night itself had hardened into shape. Upon it sat a narrow reliquary bound in tarnished silver wire. A loop of cord knotted into 3 angles lay across the lid like a sleeping serpent. I touched the wire and felt a pulse. Not mine. Too slow, too deep. Matching the drag of the tide, but reversed as though the sea were breathing in. A whisper rose from the reliquary. Not words at first, more like the muscle memory of language. Then a name formed. Marion. Followed by another. My own. As if the box were remembering us aloud. I should have stepped back. Yet the chapel seemed to tilt toward the shelf, gravity bending the room, offering me forward. I lifted the reliquary, and the cord tightened of its own accord. Not to bind my wrist, but to guide it. Heat moved through the metal. A fever that did not burn my skin yet simmered in the bones beneath. And behind the wall, something shifted, a faint ripple as if water pressed against stone from the other side. The hum grew clearer, not loud, but impossibly certain, and I understood why the door had been sealed rather than destroyed. You cannot kill a tide. You only delay the hour it chooses to arrive. By noon the sky had the flat color of pewter, and the gulls were gone, not flown inland, simply absent as if erased. Bells at the harbor rang out of step, one slow tone lagging behind the other like a heartbeat with an echo. Fishermen returned early with nets heavy, not with fish, but with weeds and the oddest trophies. A brass button from a child's shoe, a strip of black ribbon tied into a knot you could not unknot. The townspeople lit rosemary at their windows without being asked, smoke threading the lanes in thin green lines. I carried the reliquary wrapped in linen that felt damp no matter how I folded it. Each time I shifted the weight, the same pulse answered from inside, steady and patient. Sister Agatha crossed my path and did not stop, only brushed the linen with 2 fingers and whispered that some doors are not opened by keys, but by recognition. The governor's clerk posted a notice that the West Chapel was to remain shuttered for repairs. No one laughed. No one asked which repairs. At dusk, the tide stalled for a breath that felt longer than any breath the sea had ever taken. Boats bumped the pier with a soft rhythm that made the planks murmur. And down in the throat of the harbor a note rose, a single tone too low to be called a sound, more a pressure that leaned against the ribs from the inside, the same pitch I had felt in the chapel wall. Children woke from sleep speaking names their parents did not recognize. Dogs lay with paws over their ears. The reliquary warmed against my chest, as if answering a summons. And I knew the island was done, pretending this was superstition or rumor. It was admitting the truth in the only language it trusted, tide and stone and the hum beneath them. By full dark, the pressure had resolved into a cadence, not yet a hymn, but the beginning of one, and the water at the mouth of the bay began to tremble, as if something vast were turning over in its sleep. The first night the sea began to speak. We thought it was just the wind sliding through the jagged rocks at the base of St. Helena's eastern cliffs. Yet the longer we listened, the more we realized it wasn't the air at all, but something far older and deeper. The sound came in pulses, like a slow breath, or a massive heartbeat, rumbling through the stone foundations of the monastery. The sisters called it the Hymn of the Drowned, though they never explained what they meant by that, only that it had been heard before every great calamity to touch the island, and those who heard it too closely never lived to tell its true form. It was a low moan at first, stretching across the water like an animal in pain. But then, under the hum, there was something sharper, a whisper in a language that scraped at the edges of the mind, as if it was not meant to be understood by living ears. I tried to record it, but the needle on my phonograph bent into a curve before a single groove could be etched. And when I told Sister Corvina, she only told me to keep my head down when the tide went out, and to never stand alone on the cliff path after midnight. She said the hymn comes from below, but not from the sea itself. rather from the thing that sleeps beneath it, and that if it wakes, St. Helena will not be an island anymore. It will be a mouth, and everything on it will be swallowed whole. Yet her eyes betrayed something even darker, as if she knew the hymn was not a warning but an invitation, one that certain people here have been waiting lifetimes to answer, and now the waves were beginning to carry it straight into the heart of the town. By the time I reached the high western ridge, the island had fallen into a silence so complete it felt like sound itself had been stolen. The air was thick and heavy, every movement through it like walking under water, each step dragging at my legs, as if the earth wanted me to stay here forever. And there, on the ridge's jagged spine, I saw it. The black column of smoke, twisting not upward like fire but downward, sinking into the ground as if the soil itself was swallowing it whole, and circling this impossible sight were figures draped in deep crimson robes, faces entirely veiled, hands moving in slow, deliberate gestures that reminded me of both prayer and execution. The kind of movements meant not for the living, but for something watching from a place you cannot see, their voices low and humming, vibrating inside my ribs, making it hard to breathe. And I realized with horror that I recognized the cadence. It was the same rhythm, whispered by the dying sailors when they washed ashore, the same mutter I had heard in the night outside my shuttered window. But here it was louder, sharper, laced with a kind of hunger, the smoke growing thicker and thicker, until it was no longer black, but a deep, wet red, a color you could almost taste, and the robed figures turned their veiled heads toward me in unison, their humming abruptly stopping. The silence that followed was worse than the sound, for in that pause I felt them not looking at me, but inside me, rooting through memories I had never told another soul, weighing them, measuring them, and deciding something I could not name. And then they simply parted, creating a narrow path that led directly into the sinking smoke, an unspoken invitation, or perhaps an order. My heart pounded, my legs trembled, but the part of me that still thought of escape was growing smaller, as if the island itself was whispering that the only way out was through that unnatural red fog, and before I could think twice, my foot had crossed the first step into their circle, the air instantly thicker, my skin prickling like hundreds of invisible needles dragging down my arms, the ground beneath me vibrating as though I were standing on the chest of something sleeping far below, something that might wake at any second. The moonlight over St. Helena that night felt wrong, as if it had been pulled through something before reaching us, its pale glow landing heavy on the courtyard stones, making them seem wet though no rain had fallen. The air pressed against my chest with a thick weight, and I could hear the faintest rhythm beneath the silence, like something breathing underground. The father had ordered us not to leave our rooms, but doors in this place have a habit of unlocking themselves when the right thoughts pass through your head. And so I stepped out, my bare feet finding the courtyard cold and strange underfoot, the cobblestones vibrating faintly as if some distant engine worked far below the convent. I moved toward the chapel without meaning to, my steps not entirely my own, until I stood before the wooden doors, each one carved with twisting, unfamiliar letters that hadn't been there that morning. My hand reached for the iron handle, though it burned against my skin, and when I pulled it open, I saw that the pews were gone, replaced by a deep pit in the center of the floor, something shifting in the darkness below it like water that hated to be seen. Voices rose from it in a chant that did not sound like any language I had heard. Though each word burrowed somewhere into my chest and made my heart stumble, I leaned forward, unable to stop, and the air rising from the pit smelled not of decay, but of earth freshly dug, like graves opened before their time. Then from the shadows came the shape of a girl, or what used to be a girl, her skin the color of candle wax, her hands covered in something dark, and she looked directly at me with eyes that knew my name, though I had not spoken it. Her mouth moved without sound, but I heard the meaning as clearly as if she had spoken aloud. "It's not buried yet." And before I could step back, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling toes, out the same place the others had gone, though I knew in my gut that for me the landing would be different, because they had been taken, and I was being invited. It was only in the final week before the disappearance that the entire town seemed to be under some shared weight, A silence that wasn't natural but engineered, the kind where even the dogs stopped barking at night, and children who once laughed in the schoolyard now walked in rigid lines as though they were already part of the island's ceremony, the one no outsider had ever witnessed and lived to describe. I noticed how the women of the order began wearing black veils even during the day, and how they refused to look directly at the ocean as if something far worse than drowning waited out there. The mainland ferry arrived empty for 3 days straight, not a single passenger or crate of supplies, and when I asked about it at the dock, the harbour-master pretended not to hear me, his eyes fixed instead on the rusting chain that hung from the pier into the black water. I was beginning to realize that St. Helena was never an island you simply visited. It was a place that either consumed you or let you go, and for reasons I still didn't understand, I was being kept just long enough for something important to happen. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the sound again, the one that had haunted me since my first night. Not the cry of an animal, not the wind, but a chorus of voices speaking in a tongue I didn't know yet somehow felt deep in my chest. The sound was coming from beneath the floorboards of my rented room, and when I pressed my ear against the wood, I could swear I felt warmth rising up, as though the island itself was breathing through me, preparing me for something it had been planning all along. I should have left then, but by that point I think I already knew the truth. You don't leave St. Helena because the island doesn't let you decide when you go. It decides for you, and when it does, it's never in the way you expect. The waves outside were louder now, but they weren't breaking against the shore. They were answering the voices. And so the gates of St. Helena remained closed, the island itself shrinking into a speck against the endless water. But the weight of it, the reality of what we'd uncovered, clung to me like damp linen. I could never peel away. I had entered thinking the truth was a buried thing, waiting for some brave soul to unearth it. But the truth here had teeth, and it chose who could live to speak it. The faces I saw in those final hours, the girls with blank eyes, the nun with the quill, the man in the ledger room whose expression never changed, were burned into the marrow of my thoughts. And every night since, I felt the subtle presence of something just beyond the veil, watching, measuring, waiting for a moment when I might forget to lock my door. I never went back, but I learned something the night I left, a truth about certain places, certain institutions. They aren't bound to geography, they aren't fixed to the soil. They can follow, they can slip between the cracks in your life. They can make the very air feel like the corridors you swore you'd escaped. Sometimes when I walk past a school or a church or a hospital, I hear it, faint, but there, the same sound I heard on St. Helena's 3rd floor, the dragging of something heavy across the wood, deliberate, patient, never rushing, as if it knows I can't outrun it, and I wonder if the island is waiting for me, or if it's already here. In the end, there are no clean endings, no safety in distance. St. Helena did not disappear when its doors shut. It simply found other doors, other names, other uniforms to wear. And as long as the world clings to its illusions of safety, it will keep feeding, keep teaching, keep taking. So remember this. If you ever feel the warmth leave a room, if you ever hear the sound of paper shuffling when you're alone, if the light shifts and every shadow seems a little too precise, do not call you. Do not investigate, because some truths are not just dangerous to know. They are designed to make sure that once you see them, you are theirs, and there is no leaving. Not really, only waiting for the day they decide it's time to bring you back.